Welcome everyone, welcome back to this afternoon's GRIP sessions. We've got a really exciting set of talks. It's going to be quite intense. I hope you've all had a relaxing, brief lunch break. So first up, we have one of our medal lecturers, our keynote talk. We've got Matthew Warke, Dr. Matthew Warke from St Andrews, and is that correct? No, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, from St Andrews. Thanks very much. And he's the 2021 postdoctoral medal recipient, and he's going to talk to us about the work that he won that award for. So do you want to take it away, Matt, talking about the relative timing of atmospheric oxygenation?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Matthew Warke. I was, until recently, I was a postdoc at the University of St Andrews, and I'm going to be talking today about this thing that has been interesting me for the last sort of 8 years or so, which is understanding different perturbations of the atmosphere and of the climate during the early Paleoproterozoic, particularly the relationship between atmospheric oxygenation and glaciation. And so I'm generally going to talk around the paper that was mentioned that was published last year, where we looked at trying to constrain the relative time differences between the Great Oxidation Event and the Paleoproterozoic so-called snowball Earth event as well. So a big shout out to the other authors here, to my colleagues at St Andrews and to the ERC who funded this work. If you have any follow-up questions, of course, you can find me at these two emails. I still have access to my St Andrews email, so you can catch me there. Okay, so sorry, just let me adjust this speaker window a minute. So yeah, so basically, if we jump in, during the early Paleoproterozoic, we have some very interesting supercrustal successions deposited on most of the major modern continents and cratonic interiors, and those supercrustal successions contain evidence of glacial deposits. So these are commonly known from the Capval, from the Superior, but we also have them on the Pilbara and the Colla Karelia as well. Now, what's quite interesting about this, particularly in the case of the Capval craton, is that these glacial deposits also coexist with magmatic units that have paleomagnetic evidence indicating that they were extruded in the low latitudes. And this opens up the possibility that these are snowball Earth-style pan glaciations. And these successions are also the successions from the early Paleoproterozoic that preserve evidence through a varying suite of geochemical redox proxies. They preserve rising evidence of marine and atmospheric oxygen during the Great Oxidation Event. And so a question that I've had for a while is to feed into this debate about which came first. The glaciations, known as the Huronian glaciations in the early Paleoproterozoic, or atmospheric oxygenation, that is to say the Great Oxidation Event. And what's our understanding of this based on? It seems like a really simple question to try and figure out which of these came first, but that's based on our understanding of the age of these units and how they fit together, that is to say their stratigraphic correlation. And then a sort of secondary question to that are, what are the causal relationships between the rise of oxygen and climate change, particularly major glaciations? Oh. So to start off, just a quick primer on the methods that we use. So the kind of gold standard for tracing atmospheric oxygenation in the early Paleoproterozoic is the use of the quadruple sulfur isotope proxy. In particular, what we're looking for is the loss of a mass-independent fractionation signal in those sulfur isotope trends. Now, how does that work? I'm not going to get into too much of this because I'd like to go on to the data and the discussion. But generally, we can think of the sulfur isotope, the atmospheric sulfur isotope signal in the early Paleoproterozoic is working in one of two ways. Prior to the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere, solar UV was able to photolyze volcanically emitted sulfur dioxide, producing reduced and oxidized aerosols which carried a mass independently fractionated sulfur isotope signal, or sulfur Meth is commonly the S-Meth or sulfur Meth is commonly the shorthand used. Now, in an atmosphere that lacks oxygen, these reduced aerosols and the oxidized aerosols can have separate rain-out pathways. And so they make their way to the sediment-water interface and are incorporated into the rock record. And they carry either a positive or a negative magnitude signal. And so as you can see in this graph here, between about 4 and about 2.4 billion years ago, looking at cap delta 33 and cap delta 36s, that is to say, different ways of visualizing quadruple sulfur isotope trends, you can see the large scatter is indicative of this kind of pathway in operation. After the rise of oxygen, however, doesn't have to be a lot of oxygen, just a small amount, the reduced aerosol pathway becomes oxidized, and as a result, homogenization occurs in the atmosphere. And so this has the net effect of erasing the mass-independent signal in the atmosphere, and so no signal is recorded at the sediment-water interface and makes it into the geological record. And so you can see in the graph after about 2.4, all of these signals, whether positive or negative, cap delta 33 or cap delta 36s, they all ramp down to about 0. And this is what we refer to as the sulfur Meth transition. And it's one of a suite of changes that are happening. It's sometimes used as shorthand for the Great Oxidation Event, but I think it's one of a suite of changes that are happening in a wider period of time, which we refer to as the Great Oxidation Event. Now, there's still an awful lot that we don't know about this transition, about when sulfur Meth disappears. We don't know for exactly when it happens on each of the different cratons. And also, we don't know exactly if this, it's always been theorized that this transition is globally synchronous. It's unidirectional. It happens once in the history, in Earth history. But there is a growing body of recent evidence that suggests that might not be the case. Now, that could be due to atmospheric conditions, or it could be that we just don't have the preservation of that synchronous transition in the geological record because of recycling effects, or because we've put the stratigraphy together incorrectly. And so we have apparent oscillations introduced by not correlating correctly. So there's still a lot to do in our understanding of this. So to move on to our study then, we wanted to look at the quadruple sulfur isotope record of somewhere that was less studied than, for example, Western Australia and South Africa. And so we looked at the Paleoproterozoic Sedimentary and Polysarca formations on the Kola Peninsula in modern-day Russia. And they were coming from the Far Deep drilling program. Those drill cores are stored in Norway with the NGU. And the two formations are recorded in drill cores 1A and 3A. They're both shallow marine successions, with the younger Polysarca sedimentary formation, the top of that, is glacially influenced and is capped with a glacial diamictite. What's great about these units is that we have really good age control on them. So the Sedimentary was deposited between around 2501 and 2.44 billion years ago, and the Polysarca between about 2.44 and 2.43 billion years ago. So we have quite tight age control. Perhaps not for other parts of geological history, but for the Paleoproterozoic, this is pretty cool. So a quick note on our methods. So we measured these are bulk walk quadruple sulfur isotope measurements that we measured at the University of St Andrews using a Curie point pyrolysis techniques. This is slightly different to the standard way of fluorinating these samples. But this Curie point pyrolysis technique was developed originally by Yuichiro Ueno's lab and published in 2015. And so we have replicated that in St Andrews, and we're able to generate very nice data. We've conducted an awful lot of standard runs after we developed this line in 2017, 2018, and then tested it for a year before we did any analysis, and it's continuing to produce good data now. So what are the results? So in the Sedimentary sedimentary formation, the older of the two, we do see a persistent, low magnitude, but discernible sulfur Meth signal in both cap delta 33S and cap delta 36S. The delta 34S is more variable, but it's still fairly consistent between around -10 and 0 per mil. In the Polysarca sedimentary formation, then we have a slightly different trend. The values here are indicative, again, low magnitude, but indicative here of mass-dependent fractionation. The one difference would be that we see a slight difference at the top of the Polysarca in the diamictite grey wacky member at the top of the succession. We see, as we'll see in a second, the data there more closely resemble what we're seeing in the Sedimentary, the older of the two formations. So I apologize for the, I think the resolution has gone a wee bit on this, but this is how the data look more when we do more of the traditional delta 33, delta 36S cross plots. And so in the case of the sedimentary formation, this older formation, all of this data, which is represented by the circles and subdivided by fasces association, those are falling on a line with a slope of around about -1.8. This is not quite the same as, but fairly consistent with the ARA, which is to say the Archean reference array, which is the cap delta 36, cap delta 33S relationship that we see in most pre-GOE sediments. The Polysarca in the limestone members at the bottom of the Polysarca formation, that's actually behaving with very consistently showing patterns of mass-dependent fractionation. But the difference is the inconsistency in the Polysarca is, as I said, this diamictite and doleranite sample, which is coming from a turbidite and then the glacial diamictite at the top of succession, which are shown in the circles. They're plotting very clearly with the Sedimentary data. And if we take a look also at how that appears in a cap delta 33S, delta 34S plot, we can see that the sedimentary formation behaves again like a lot of Neoarchean and early Paleoproterozoic pre-GOE sediments, and showing this kind of positive relationship between the two, whereas the Polysarca sedimentary formation shows much more fractionation in delta 34S and very, very low magnitude cap delta 33S. It's positive. So if we just quickly recap before we then take what we have here in Fennoscandia and try to draw parallels elsewhere, what are we actually saying is going on the Kola Peninsula? Well, the sedimentary formation preserves a low magnitude but discernible sulfur Meth signal with negative values. The Polysarca, negative cap delta 33S values, I should say. And the Polysarca sedimentary formation preserves mass-dependent fractionation trends. So this, combined with the geochronological constraints that we have in these two formations from the far deep drilling program and associated work, means that we can place the sulfur Meth transition in Fennoscandia sometime between 2.5 and 2.43 billion years ago. This is slightly earlier than most people talk about the transition being, but completely consistent with what we see in other areas, as we'll see. Quite clearly, relatively, we can see that this transition precedes the Polysarca glaciation, but to be honest, we're not entirely sure that the Polysarca glaciation is a snowball earth deposit, so we'll come back to that. This is a point that simply we just don't have time to touch on, but there has been some discussion in the literature that a lot of the early Paleoproterozoic sulfur Meth record could be generated by recycling of older signals under an oxidizing atmosphere. But actually, those modeling studies tend to predict positive cap delta 33S values through what they call the crustal memory effect. So it's just a small point that we don't have time to unpack, but the values that we see are not really consistent with this kind of recycling model. But we do see evidence. That's what we're seeing, I think, in the upper polysarca, in the turbidites, and in the diamictites. We are seeing evidence for sulfur Meth recycling, but rather than a kind of generic recycling effect caused by runoff, it seems to be restricted to specific facies, to the glacial and dolerinite facies. And I think this is reflecting discrete periods of detrital input into the basin. So the take home from a recycling point of view would be that I think it's possible that the background atmospheric signal is not always drowned out as is kind of being assumed by any kind of recycling that's happening after the rise of oxygen. It may be possible to see through that if you carefully integrate your data and with the sedimentology. And so I'm coming to the end of my time, so I just want to finish with a few thoughts then on the main thrust of our paper, which was how these trends compare globally. So this plot was kind of my attempt to quite simply kind of strip away a lot of the uncertainty and confusion around the stratigraphic constraints on the Great Oxidation Event, talking specifically about the atmospheric sulfur Meth transition. And so what we found, the window that we found for this transition in Fennoscandia is shown in the right. And then the red bars are basically showing the first occurrence of mass-dependently fractionated sulfur signals, and the green bars are showing us the last occurrence of sulfur Meth in each of these areas: the Transvaal and Griqualand West basins in South Africa, where I did my PhD, the Huronian supergroup in North America, and the Hammersey Basin in Western Australia. And the big caveat that we don't really know what's happening in Western Australia, and we don't have much age control on what's happening in North America. What we do find is that there is a window shown by this orange bar where it is possible still to have a globally synchronous sulfur Meth transition. We're not necessarily seeing things that are we're not seeing trends that disagree with each other on different cratons. The other thing to note is that there is only one diamictite, glacial diamictite, that we know in the Paleoproterozoic, because it also is associated independently with paleomagnetic evidence. There's only one that we know is definitely a low latitude deposit, and that is the Machinieni diamictite in Griqualand West. And because of recent work by Ashley Gumsley and others, we know we have quite tight age control on that, and that's this little blue box here. And so applying the age constraints that we have from Fennoscandia, knowing that the transition we have in Fennoscandia occurs relatively before the Polysarca glaciation, and having the independent age control on the Machinieni snowball earth deposit in Griqualand West, and knowing that seems to be deposited before the first appearance of mass-dependently fractionated sulfur in the post-Massberg group. The take-home message is that we believe that the sulfur Meth transition occurred prior to a snowball earth deposit. And so, as I know I've kind of come to the end of my time, I'll just put these conclusions here and just say that because we are getting closer to understanding the order of these events, though we don't fully understand, there's fierce debate about the stratigraphic constraints of what's going on, and there are stratigraphic issues to resolve. We are getting closer to understanding cause and effect and understanding what may have been causing some of these major perturbations to the climate during the early Earth. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. Are there questions? I have lots of questions, but if you do have a question, put one in the chat. In the meantime, maybe you mentioned stratigraphic control, and also that this particular section has really good age controls. Why is that, and how is it dated?
The reason really that it has these kind of controls is because it is associated with a lot of coeval magmatic activity, particularly lavas. There's a lot of intrusions in the Fennoscandian sequences, which provide sort of minimum ages or maximum ages, but it is the lavas that we get within the successions, particularly the komatiites and the dating of the komatiites, which really help us to pin down the relative ages of the two successions and place them within these windows. That is a problem that we have in South Africa, in the Eastern Transvaal Basin. And the big problem that we have there is that the sulfur myth signals that we have and the mass dependent signals that we have are often occurring in sedimentary sequences which are unconformity bound. And so we have them kind of floating in time. And that's the exact same problem when we go to the Huronian supergroup. Again, they're unconformity bound packages floating in time with no kind of coeval magmatism providing that independent age constraint. So Fennoscandia is great from that perspective, but you still also have to be careful of successions that have had interaction with these kinds of things.
Great, thanks very much. I think it's really fascinating, this idea that the glaciations might precede the oxygenation, but I don't think we have time to get into it. So there are no other questions in the chat, and it is 1 o'clock. So maybe if people want to ask Matthew questions, please do go ahead. I'm sure maybe he's hanging around for a little while longer.